Hello, I'm Regina Casey, a member of the British Columbia Cognitive Remediation Working Group. This group comprises of members from several organizations in British Columbia, including the BC Schizophrenia Society, the Ministry of Health, 3 health authorities, University of British Columbia, and myself from Psychosocial Rehabilitation British Columbia, our advanced practice, to name a few. So a full list of our partners is available at the end of the video in the credits. So our Cognitive Remediation British Columbia Working Group developed in about 2016. And in 2017, we had our very first successful conference with about 120 people. More recently, we identified a need to develop additional resources and supports for the field. And with that in mind, we developed this video. It's intended to give an overview of the components of cognition, to describe some interventions available. A key message of this video is intended to be one of hope. Cognitive remediation therapy is the only intervention that has consistently shown to improve cognition for individuals who live with schizophrenia. In terms of function, we see improved social and occupational function. And really, we see a decrease in the impact of disability for individuals who are living with significant mental illness. So our first speaker is Dr. Tom Amon, and he will describe the 5 key components of cognition. Dr. Mahesh Menon will then describe how those dimensions of cognition can impact somebody's function who might live with schizophrenia. We'll then hear from Dr. Amy Burns, who will speak about 3 interventions for cognitive remediation. And finally, we'll hear from Jessica, who will share with us her experience of cognitive remediation therapy and how it impacted her daily life. We hope that this short video will be helpful for you, and we encourage you to please have a look at the resources at the end of the video, and please do visit our website for additional information. And so now it's over to Dr. Tom Amon, who will speak about the big 5 aspects of cognition.
Hello. Today I'm going to give a brief overview of what cognition is and the main elements or domains of cognition that we use in our everyday lives. Simply put, cognition is just thinking. It's the mental processes that allow us to gain knowledge and to put that knowledge to action in the world. Some of these cognitive processes we're aware of, and some of them we're really not aware of at all. Cognition in general is less concerned with what we know, the facts, as it is with how we get to know things and how we can put that knowledge into action. So the brain has a lot of work that it has to do, and so there are quite a number of different cognitive processes. One traditional way to describe them is to divide cognition into verbal versus nonverbal abilities. Verbal abilities include things like being able to read and speak and write, whereas nonverbal abilities include things like dealing with objects or how things are arranged in space, paying attention to detail, eye-hand coordination, or other kinds of tasks that don't involve language. Before I come to the big 5 domains of cognition, which are attention, learning and memory, speed of processing, executive functions, and social cognition, I want to briefly talk about how the brain needs lower levels of basic data, which is then fed up and used by the brain to engage in more sophisticated processing. So I live in an area that's got bears, and before I can cope with the presence of a bear, I need to know that it's there. I can see, I can hear, or sometimes I can even smell things that alert me to the presence of a bear by my senses detecting shape or color, size, or texture that a bear is present. Now these data are really sensory data that are fundamental building blocks. I mention this because some cognitive remediation computer programs will specifically target those basic sensory processes for improvement. The old adage of you have garbage in, you get garbage out sort of applies here, because you want lower level data to be higher quality so that the output that comes when you're analyzing that data about how to cope with the bear is of also high quality. Okay, let's move on to what I call the 5 big types of cognition. And the first one is attention. So attention really simply means focusing your awareness onto something and reducing focus on something else. There are many forms of attention. So if I hear a cracking sound in the forest, I attend to that. That's simple attention. And if I stay focused on it, then that's sustained attention. If I have 2 things to do at the same time, I'm paying attention to 2 different things. That's called divided attention. And another form of attention relates to not being distracted by other things, to be able to filter out stimuli which aren't really relevant to the task at hand that you're attending to. If attention is good, then it's easier to learn new things, which brings us to our second cognitive domain, which is learning and memory. You have to attend to things before you can learn them. And learning and memory are like a hand and a glove, because you can't remember something if you haven't learned it. It's often wrong to say that someone has a bad memory when in fact they didn't learn something in the first place. The general idea of attention, memory, and learning is that you have to attend to something and then you encode it or learn it. Then that information is stored in the brain, and then you have to have some way to retrieve it or recall it, which is what we generally refer to as memory. There are different kinds of memory, like memory for facts or memory for personal experiences. But there's also other forms like prospective memory, which refers to remembering to do something in the future. For example, an appointment in 3 days' time. And it's wrong, or it's unfair to assume that a person who misses appointments is uncaring or lazy, when in fact it's a prospective memory problem. A final type of memory is called working memory, which can happen in visual domains and non-verbal domains, as well as in verbal domains. And that's when you have to hold information up in your head and manipulate that information, such as the operations that would occur if you're multiplying 16 by 6 in your head. 6 times 6 is 36. You put the 6 down at the bottom, and then you have to carry the 3, and then you have to keep in mind that the 6 is down at the bottom when you've done the other multiplication. So it's that kind of process which is called working memory. The third type of cognition is speed of processing, which is just simply being quick. And this can be purely mental, or it can involve a motor or physical act as a response. So think of reaction time, for example. The fourth major domain is a large variety of functions called executive functions. And they're often associated with what we would think of as higher cortical or higher cognitive processes, and include things like reasoning, abstract thinking, problem solving, putting things in sequences like the steps to make a meal. And there's lots of other executive functions as well. One is estimations. For example, how far away the bear is from me, how fast the bear is going to get to me if it's moving towards me, or the height of a building. Another executive function is inhibition, which is the ability to stop or hold yourself back. And this is just the opposite of impulsiveness. And finally, I want to mention one other executive function, which is this amazing human ability to think about what we're thinking. And this is called metacognition. And metacognition is actually another target for a sophisticated form of cognitive remediation called metacognitive training, in which people learn to analyze what it is that they're thinking and the way in which they're thinking and change those. Finally, there's social cognition. And these are the mental processes we need to understand and navigate through the social world. And to do that successfully, we need to be able to do things like look at a person's face and understand what emotion they're expressing, to be able to read someone's body language, or to be able to have some idea of what someone's thinking in a social situation, what the other person's thinking in a social situation. Also, to be able to have some understanding of what the expectations and the normal appropriate behaviors are in a given social situation. So I'm going to conclude by just saying that of these cognitive abilities, people vary tremendously, with some people being really good at some things and not very good at other sorts of things. But every single one of these forms of cognition has been shown to be amenable to improvement with cognitive remediation. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Mahesh Menon, who will describe how difficulties with cognition and cognitive functions can affect daily living. And he'll also update us on the status of cognitive functions in persons with psychotic disorders. Thanks very much.
I want to follow up from Dr. Eamon's presentation and then talk a little bit about the impact of cognition on functioning in psychosis and schizophrenia, as well as how cognition is affected in schizophrenia and the related illnesses. So overall, what we do know is that lots of the different domains of cognition are affected in psychosis. And this is a group finding, so that means it may not be seen for everyone, but for individuals who have the diagnosis of schizophrenia as a whole, there are some difficulties across the different domains. So these difficulties for some people can be seen prior to the onset of the symptoms like hearing voices or paranoia, which are called the positive symptoms. And it can be seen before those develop, but for many people, they are typically worsened after those symptoms develop as well. And they can all be impacted by other factors which can go along with the illness, like stress or anxiety or lack of sleep or the severity of the voices that we might be hearing and so on. But when we look at how severe those particular symptoms are, particularly what we think of as the positive symptoms like hearing voices or paranoia, what we find is that the magnitude of the difficulties on these domains of cognition is actually not really related to the severity of the symptoms. So we can have a number of people who can have difficulties on those domains of cognition like memory and attention and not show very severe paranoia or voices or vice versa. But let's just take a moment to look at what are some of the difficulties that are seen in psychosis itself. So we know that there are some difficulties with paying attention, and that can be in simple attention as well as in what's called sustained attention. And those problems might also play a role in some of the memory issues that arise. And memory in schizophrenia, particularly verbal memory, is impaired and it can be inefficient. So that means that it might take a little bit longer for someone to register or learn the information, and it might be a little bit harder to recall that information as well. And there are also problems which are seen in the domains of processing speed as well as executive functioning. Now, we talked about how these difficulties may not necessarily be related to the severity of the hearing voices or the paranoia, but it does turn out that these problems with memory and attention and cognition, the magnitude of those difficulties does actually predict functioning in daily life. So in social functioning, in employment, in the ability to live independently. And it can manifest in lots of different ways. So for instance, if I was struggling with attention, it might manifest in things like leaving things on the stove or losing track of the train of conversation, or also with being able to sort of pay attention and then learn new information, which can in turn be connected to the memory problems that we might have. And so the memory problems you could see might play a role, for instance, if I have chores to do or tasks to take care of, it might be hard for me to keep track of them or to remember what are the things that need to be done at any particular time. The processing speed difficulties manifest, for instance, in challenges in a fast-paced environment like work, or even in terms of kind of keeping track of multiple things which might be going on, which in turn connect to some of the difficulties with executive functioning. So problems with multitasking or being overwhelmed by plans which have a lot of steps, and also difficulties in the context of social interactions, keeping track of these different conversations, trying to figure out what's the appropriate thing to do in different settings, those can all be manifestations of some of the executive functioning challenges that come up as well. So these cognitive problems that are seen in schizophrenia don't typically respond very well to the traditional antipsychotic medications. And so we do need specific interventions to help with improving cognition. And this is where cognitive remediation comes in. So cognitive remediation is a specialized treatment approach to help to improve these domains of cognition. And the hope is that improving cognition can in turn lead to increased independence, improved quality of life, increased ability to work, and engage more fully socially as well. And so the next talk will be by Dr. Amy Burns, who's going to be talking about what is cognitive remediation in psychosis.
So cognitive impairments are important due in large part to the role it plays with everyday life activities, including self-care, living independently, succeeding at school or work, and having meaningful social and romantic relationships. Given the link between cognition and functional outcomes that are important for everyday life, a number of strategies have been developed to address these difficulties. These strategies can be quite varied, but broadly speaking, we can call all these strategies cognitive remediation, or CR. CR methods can be divided into three major categories. First, we have restorative approaches. So this approach is based on the principle of neuroplasticity and our brain's ability to form new connections and pathways and change how its circuits are wired. Restorative interventions are usually computer-assisted, and they target simpler neurocognitive functions first before moving on and targeting more complex functions. For example, these programs often target auditory or visual processing first, followed by training in higher order memory and problem-solving skills. The tasks rely heavily on practice, and the difficulty level is carefully titrated according to individuals' ability level. Now, this approach is kind of similar to a physical therapist who prescribes consistent and sustained exercise for muscle groups that have atrophy due to disuse or damage. Now, the second approach is called compensatory training or strategy-based training. In this approach, we work around the deficit by teaching new or different ways of completing tasks to improve functioning. Oftentimes, linking client goals to these strategies can help generalize and make these activities more meaningful to clients. For example, strategies to help improve attention may include helping clients focus on one thing at a time. So we know that our attention span is limited, and we can only focus on one task at a time. Thus, by limiting multitasking, we can help improve ability to focus. Other strategies to improve attention include repeating back what you hear. So many people forget things they are told because they do not pay attention to what the person said in the first place. So repeating back what you just heard the other person say, either to yourself or to the other person, can ensure that you have initially remembered the piece of information you want to learn. So strategies to improve memory may include teaching about chunking. This is where you break down information into small, manageable chunks for processing. Or another memory strategy may be teaching about mnemonics or associations. This is linking new information that needs to be remembered with old memory. So for example, if you meet a new person and you have to remember their name, strategies, you can try to see if you know somebody else by that same name and try to picture the old person and the new person together. Another strategy that falls under the compensatory training umbrella are adaptive strategies. Now, Adaptive strategies refer to changes in the environment rather than the individual. So that is structuring the environment or making modifications to the environment to help people bypass, again, work around, compensate for the cognitive challenges. So examples of changing the environment to improve attention and concentration may include choosing a quiet place to work and putting a do not disturb sign on the door when working. It may also include turning off unnecessary distracting electronic equipment such as cell phones, radio, and TV. Related to that, if someone's working on a computer, a strategy may be to turn off email programs to avoid distracting prompts about having new emails. Now, compensatory approaches emphasize the use of strengths to accomplish goals rather than focusing on deficits. The goal of compensatory training is to help clients learn and develop cognitive strategies to form long-term habits that are meaningful in the real world. A third approach focuses on social cognition. This broadly refers to mental operations that take place in social interactions, including recognizing emotions, interpreting the behavior and intentions of others. In clinical practice, people often describe difficulties perceiving social cues and effectively relating to others. So training in this area may include teaching about facial affect recognition or understanding emotions. Training may also include learning to break down complex social processes into components and practice and role-playing with these skills. So a number of research studies have shown that cognitive remediation programs can help improve functioning. Our research study shows that CR can help clients improve thinking skills that are important in getting a job. In our study, on average, twice as many clients in the CR group, or the cognitive remediation group, obtained competitive employment compared to the control group. In addition, clients in the training program work more hours compared to clients who did not receive cognitive remediation. So in conclusion, difficulties with attention, memory, problem solving, and other cognitive skills are almost universal, and they interfere with key living skills. The good news is that effective treatments do exist to strengthen and improve cognitive skills.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm 30 years old and I was diagnosed with psychosis when I was 22.
So Jessica, tell me, what are some cognitive difficulties that you have?
I've had problems with short-term memory, remembering people's names, and remembering which items to fetch from the storage room. I've also had problems with thinking speed, where at my job I've had problems packing groceries and other items in an efficient and organized manner.
Jessica, tell me a bit about your experience with the cognitive remediation program.
I did computer brain training exercises as well as met up with a psychologist once a week where we talked about skills and strategies that I could use to apply at the workplace.
Jessica, tell me some of the skills that you learned as a result of the training program.
So one of the skills that I learned as a result of the training program was chunking, where I had to look at a grocery list and memorize as many items as I could from that grocery list. The way I tried to memorize that was by chunking, where I grouped similar items together into smaller, different groups so that I could remember them better. So another skill that I learned was how to plan ahead, where I learned how to look at what items were coming through the conveyor belt and think beforehand how to pack these items into the boxes or the buggies before I had to actually pack them. So related to that, I also learned flexible thinking, where I learned that items can be moved around after I pack them and they're not fixed in one spot in the box or the buggy after I initially put them inside. So to help me keep things organized, I use my phone quite a bit. I use the phone's calendar app to note down my schedule, and I also make notes in my phone's memo to keep track of what I need to remember.